Trump stated that, in his opinion, both Putin and Zelenskyy are ready for an agreement on Ukraine. The only question is, on whose terms?
You recently spoke with Zelenskyy.
Not so long ago, yes.
How did that conversation go?
I think he's ready to make a deal.
But no progress. Apart from that,
I think there has been great progress. No, he is ready for an agreement. And I believe President Putin is also ready to make a deal. And then we will stop the killing of thousands of young people every week.
did Kirill Dmitriev say this to your colleague? To your colleagues in the US? Kirill Dmitriev, the Russian negotiator currently in Washington.
I'm not talking about specific people. I'll just tell you that there are many good discussions happening about Ukraine and Russia.
Hello, my name is Kateryna Soliar, and there will be no usual countdown of time, because here as in a vacuum only one time is frozen 24 hours left. And it seems to me that Donald Trump has started to forget what those 24 hours were actually allocated for. He has focused, perhaps, on minerals, tariffs, or bringing American business back to Russia. And here's the paradox. Donald Trump urges American businesses to return to the United States because then they won't be subject to tariffs. But at the same time, he's preparing an additional airfield for them. A Russian one, as you can imagine. Although it is spoken there so often that I would not count on this place. Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's special representative and head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, was in Washington on April 1 and 2. Even sanctions against him were temporarily suspended during that time, as I've mentioned before. And upon his return he made a series of bold statements. First of all, he says that American business is ready to replace the European companies that left the Russian market 3 years ago. Moscow and Washington are discussing the restoration of direct air connections. And this point I like the most. Significant progress has been made regarding a ceasefire in Ukraine. So, the first 2 points are specific, and the third, as always, is very vague. Significant progress. What does that mean? Dmitriev also assures that the Trump administration hears Russia and understands its concerns. According to him, high-level contacts are already taking place, and new talks with the US may happen soon. I don't know how much truth there is in his previous statements, but that Putin and Trump may soon talk on the phone again, that's what Western media are saying. Although Trump's entourage is opposed to such a call to Putin until there's a ceasefire in Ukraine. The conversation between the politicians would only be acceptable if Putin tells the White House that he agrees to a complete ceasefire in the war against Ukraine, as NBC News reports. We continue. According to Dmitriev's statements, when asked by a journalist if there are security guarantees for Ukraine that would be acceptable to Moscow, Dmitriev replied that, in his opinion, Ukraine's NATO membership, as our president has stated, is absolutely impossible. And I think this would be widely recognized, including by the Trump administration. At the same time, he notes that certain security guarantees in a different form, in a different way, may be acceptable for Russia. Interesting, again, what does this mean? Because Peskov says that it's still too early to talk about any guarantees. Moscow feels cautious optimism after Kirill Dmitriev's contacts in the US, said Putin's spokesman. He also said that a lot of fakes are being published in the media. This is how Peskov commented on reports from American media that Trump's entourage advises him not to speak with Putin. Putin supports the idea of a ceasefire in Ukraine, but there are many nuances, and the issue of security guarantees for Ukraine is a subject of difficult negotiations. I'll just remind you that since the beginning of negotiations between the US and Russia on a ceasefire in Ukraine, Ukraine has been shelled 50% more. That's exactly half more. And Peskov says that for now it's impossible to talk about any specifics in this context. The Russian economy is strong and successful, and it's developing, but additional efforts will be needed to sustain this amid global turbulence. He doesn't know how the world relates to Russia, or how Russia relates to the world, but nonetheless. Now, let's recall. In response to the question of why tariffs haven't been imposed on Russia and Belarus, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that we don't trade with them. I also clarified that, for now. But in reality, the US still trades with Russia. Their trade turnover in 2024 was $3.5 billion. which, of course, is much less compared to the pre-war period of $30 billion, but it still exists. It's like no one is trading with penguins, but tariffs were imposed on them. Additionally, if the United States were to impose tariffs on Russia and Belarus using the same method applied to other countries, the trade deficit would be divided by the export volume of goods, excluding services, and then halved. Based on this calculation, the tariffs on Russia would be 42%, while those on Belarus would be 24%.
A whole belt of villains, like Russia, North Korea, and other similar countries, have not been subjected to sanctions. These tariffs are called sanctions because they are nothing more than sanctions. And no less than sanctions, justified by the fact that they are already under sanctions anyway. In other words, the imposition of tariffs is practically equated to sanctions in the words of the United States, but okay. Here, they say that there are no economic relations with them, so why impose tariffs on them? They have been reduced to a minimum. I remind you that the trade turnover with Russia is roughly the same as with Ukraine for the United States. Yes, given the size of the Russian economy, the American one, and so on, this is indeed a drop by tens of times compared to what it was before the full-scale invasion. But today, it still equals approximately what it is with Ukraine. Tariffs are imposed on Ukraine, but not on Russia. And poor Moldova, next door, with a smaller trade turnover than Russia, gets a 31% tariff on its goods, coming from some unclear, absolutely confusing future. Just like Israel, with which the trade turnover is high, and which is a key ally of the US. Its key neighbors, the Arab countries, with which Israel has historically tense relations, are subject to a 10% tariff, while Israel itself faces a higher tariff of 17%. This higher rate reflects Israel's status as a key ally and partner of the United States in the region, highlighting the unique and strategic nature of their relationship. Financial Times analysts calculated and looked into how these percentages were determined. They figured out the formula used to arrive at these figures. It was simply the balance of imports and exports multiplied by each other, and then divided by 2. All economists are scratching their heads, trying to understand how this relates to the economy, let alone to econometrics, which requires precise analysis and data interpretation. Because this is just an arithmetic formula that a fourth-grade student could do, with no justification behind it except for basic mathematical logic, add, subtract, divide.
Tell me, what is this if not manipulation? By the way, Trump's manipulations were caught by the journalists at the Washington Post. At least part of the arguments that US President Donald Trump used to justify the imposition of tariffs on all imports into the country were either misleading or outright false. And, as it turned out, it's not that difficult to prove. The publication takes Trump's statement that for years, American workers were forced to sit on the sidelines while other countries became rich and powerful at our expense, as the US president says. And they show that, in reality, the United States is neither poor nor weak. The US has the highest GDP per capita among all major countries, including Western European nations. Trump also stated that the United States imposes only a 2.5% tariff on motorcycles, highlighting the relatively low tariff rate on this specific category of goods. Meanwhile, Thailand charges 60%, India 70%, Vietnam 75%, and other countries charge even more. And according to the president, for decades until now, the United States has charged only a 2.5% tariff on cars made abroad, while, as he claims, the European Union imposes a tariff of more than 10% on American-made cars. Is Trump unlucky with math? But the journalists say that the figures Trump mentioned are incorrect. They can be manipulative. Yes, India does impose a 50% tariff on motorcycles, but it is not as high as 70%, as some may have suggested. And recently, the country announced it would lower tariffs to 40%. The US has had a 25% tariff on imported pickup trucks for 50 years, a rate that significantly exceeds the European Union's tariff on automobiles, highlighting the difference in trade policies between the two regions.
Trump claims Taiwan is charged 75%, but it's 50%, and India 70%, but it's 40%. When he says that Toyota sells 1 million cars in the US every year, but Americans don't sell as many in Japan, it turns out that American cars tend to consume more fuel, are bulkier in size, and simply don't fit well in the narrower streets and infrastructure of Tokyo. And then, on and on. They started looking at this and saying, "Stop, Donald Trump. He says that in previous years, my tariffs brought in hundreds of billions, but it turns out it was only 75.
Moreover, the US had to spend another $28 billion on helping farmers who lost their businesses when China retaliated with tariffs. And, by the way, China will do this again. Moreover, the US had to spend another $28 billion on helping farmers who lost their businesses when China retaliated with tariffs. And, by the way, China will do this again. China has already announced that it will impose 34% tariffs on all American goods in response to the tariffs President Donald Trump introduced against China. This once again proves the truth: the one who imposes tariffs loses, not the one against whom they are imposed.
Tariffs led to political defeat. When McKinley imposed tariffs in 1890, they lost 50% of their seats in the next election. When Hawley and Smoot imposed tariffs in 1930, they lost the House and Senate for 60 years. So this is not only bad economically, but also politically.
Interestingly, this is what Rand Paul, a very close MAGA senator, is saying. But Rand Paul took it a step further and recently joined the group of breakaway Republicans in voting for a resolution that calls for lifting tariffs on Canada, signaling his growing opposition to the current trade policies. Thanks to these four, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Mitch McConnell, plus 47 Democrats, the resolution got the necessary 51 votes in the Senate. However, the House, led by Speaker Johnson, immediately blocked it, but the fact remains. Senator Rand Paul is one of the most active opponents of U.S. aid to Ukraine. A year ago, along with J.D. Vance and Mike Lee, he blocked it until the very end. Paul also made headlines when he became the only member of the Senate committee to vote against the proposal to freeze Russian assets for the benefit of Ukraine, setting himself apart from his colleagues on this controversial issue. Now, since we mentioned MAGA, Make America Great Again, there's more to discuss here. This is one of those cases where you really wanted to make America great, but instead you caused a crash on Wall Street. Who felt the effects of the Liberation Day first? That's right, the American stock market. The S&P index, which tracks the performance of the 500 largest American companies, fell by 4%, marking the most significant market crash since September 2022, reflecting a major downturn in the stock market. The biggest losses were suffered by multinational companies and large importers of foreign goods into the U.S. Stocks of Nike, Dollar Tree, Gabelli Utility Trust and even tech giants Nvidia and Tesla were hit as well. Those who have been with Trump since his campaign speeches are still feeling it. Until now, actually. On the New York Stock Exchange, the number of declining stocks far outnumbered the rising ones by 6 times. So, when we talk about the world facing its third recession, which hasn't yet become global but still marks the third such downturn in just 20 years, it's no longer a distant possibility in the future, but a reality we are living through right now. In the context of the global economy, a recession is a period when the economies of many countries shrink or contract simultaneously. Since World War II, there have been only 2 such events, the financial crisis of 2008-2009 and the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. To trigger a global recession, there needs to be a colossal shock. If we and Trump, in response to the West, are hit by shocks from other countries, it could become the third such economic crisis. This would threaten rising prices and, consequently, a decrease in trade. If imports into the US fall, the global economy will lose a key driver. And here, you just want to say, Harris warned about this.
Goldman Sachs stated that Donald Trump's plan will worsen the economy. Mine will strengthen the economy. The Wharton School said that Donald Trump's plan will actually undermine the deficit. 16 Nobel laureates described his economic plan as one that will increase inflation and lead to a recession by the middle of next year. You just have to look at where we are and where we stand on these issues. And I encourage you to find out. Donald Trump actually has no plan for you because he's more interested in protecting himself than in taking care of you.
In terms of numbers, the 500 richest people in the world collectively lost a staggering $208 billion as a result of the tariffs imposed by Trump, highlighting the significant economic impact of his trade policies. The wealthiest, meaning the biggest losses, were suffered by Mark Zuckerberg, who lost almost $18 billion. 9% of his wealth due to the drop in Meta's stock. Jeff Bezos lost almost $16 billion due to the decline in Amazon's stock. Elon Musk also lost $11 billion. The total losses for the year amounted to $110 billion. Although, I think for Musk, the worst may still be ahead, because his father always seems to support him. Last time, he said that young Elon was friends with the black staff, and now he seems to have a certain admiration for Putin. According to Elon Musk, as a man, Putin deserves respect, and in this regard, he shares similar views with his son, reflecting a shared perspective on the Russian leader's personal qualities. It's very convenient to love Putin from a distance, across the ocean. Errol also called the Russian president a strong leader and noted that it will only become clear over time who truly started the war in Ukraine. But if we talk about achievements, we have to acknowledge that Trump did indeed crash the oil market. In just a day and a half after the introduction of tariffs, the Brent benchmark dropped from $75 to below $67.50. The lowest point since December 2, 2021. In fact, over 3.5 years of full-scale invasion. Trump also got help from OPEC Plus countries, which at yesterday's meeting agreed to increase production threefold next month. Most likely, these figures are not the outcome that Trump had hoped for, which is why the US president has already stated that he's open to discussing adjustments to the tariffs, but only if other countries present something truly extraordinary or compelling in their proposals. Peeking aboard Air Force One, Trump defended his tariff program, despite the market crash, saying his reaction was expected, and of course, he believes the economic turbulence will calm down.
It depends. If someone says they're going to offer us something phenomenal, tariffs give us great negotiating power.
And then he added that now is the best time to get rich. Richer than ever before, says Trump. He says the market is good now, and soon there will be a boom. Not a crash, but a vertical success. I've heard this somewhere before. And in this, Dmitry Medvedev, the alcoholic, saw a reason to drink. A superficial thought, Russia doesn't need to panic right now in light of the new tariffs from the United States. He says it's better to sit by the shore and wait for Europe's corpse to float by. Dmitry clearly suggests sitting by the shore with a bottle, so it wouldn't be so painful if the corpse of the European Union never floats by. At least he wouldn't be wasting time. Though, I'd recommend he sit not by the river, but somewhere near an airfield. Or an oil extraction facility. That would be safer. Again, it turns out there's nothing to hear about 24 hours until peace. But let's be honest, we weren't counting on them because we know exactly who we're dealing with. Let's fight, we'll win, and see you in the next episode of 24 Hours That Left Before Peace.